The ideologue will use everything we do and with what we argue to drive us further into exclusion and strengthen his populist language to bring more people in line and to strengthen his sympathizing pack internally. Systemic and logical thinking is in our blood. They are both inherent in us by nature and help us to orientate ourselves in our world. We can understand facts in relation to each other and recognize logical connections. These abilities are essential characteristics of our species. They are evolutionarily anchored in us. In our FORMWELT, basic concepts and movements of thought from systemics, logic and mathematics are built in correspondingly. We could hardly create a language that reflects our thinking if we did not do so. As a result, those who work with FORMWELT and our U-form, I-form, form logic can retrieve systemic and logical thinking in a playful way and thus recapture the enormous abilities of childhood with which they, continuously learning, create themselves, their world, ever more complex on one hand and ever more specific on the other, with the difference that today we can do it consciously and reflect it linguistically. I would like to use an example of right-wing extremist thinking and how we deal with it to show how helpful these abilities are. I ask you to bear in mind that my small, easily accessible analysis is quite possible in a different way. In another word, contingent, like everything that is supposed to describe complex interrelationships. The question that concerns me and many others within this context are the following. Should we talk with right-wingers or should we better ignore them? Do we really have to endure this conflict? What is the best way to deal with right-wing rhetoric and populism? To answer these questions functionally, we have to fetch ourselves the concept of ideology. We need to know how ideologues tick in order to understand what makes sense and what doesn't, and what, perhaps in the worst case, strengthens the power of ideologues. I make a distinction between worldview and ideology. For me, worldview means the set of all models that I need to orientate myself in my world. These models must not only be verbal. Feelings, emotions belong to them just as incidents can confirm and affirm them. An ideology works for me like worldview, except that it has the added function of bringing me and others in line. The output of ideology is that I feel more secure. Ideologies help to eliminate anxiety through Gleichschaltung. Gleichschaltung is a German concept from Nazi terminology and means to force people in line in forced conformity. The more successfully ideologies deliver this for people, the more they join them. That's why small and large populists rely on fears. Anyone who thinks about this for a while will notice that worldview and ideology are often not so easily distinguished, and that it depends very much on the observer whether he perceives something as more worldview or more ideological. If we look around a little among ourselves, we see that most people can discover ideologies more easily in others than in themselves. The same goes for populism, the kind of language that is supposed to bring in line. Populism is an instrument of ideology. Thus, the more ideological a person is, the more likely it is that the populist part of his language will increase. We can understand populist language as the rhetoric that addresses our security needs, our fears. Populists use and create popular views to instrumentalize others in order to realize their personal goals. I think it's easy to see there that we all tend to ideological impulses and thus populist expressions every now and then. The only question is, do we give into them or not? The more ideological a person is, the higher the populist part of his language, the greater the impulse to bring in line. To be in line or gleichzuschalten means I myself should think my ideology dictates and others should think the same way. To be in line never applies only to others. I also make a copy of myself out of myself. I reduce my rich and fruitful realm of worldview models to a far more rigid ideology. We can grasp right and left as worldviews if we think that the impulses to bring in line are rather small. Or we see them as ideologies if we think that this impulse is massive and that populist language should trigger security fears so that those whom we address are brought into line just as we ourselves begin to bring ourselves and others in line. The more politically right we assume a person or a group of people standing, the bigger the need for populist language and ideological impulses should be observable there, at last according to our model. It is also possible, however, that we ourselves think ideologically and do not even notice that we sort someone as right-winger because we have heard a trigger in his or her language, which in turn motivates in our own ideology the impulse to exclude. Which brings me to a very important second point. Ideologies serve exclusion. Without exclusion, ideologies make no sense at all. The more extreme the ideology, the stronger the pressure to exclude. The more extreme the ideology, the more the limiter depends on the enemies of his ideology to react. Ideology needs A, fear, and B, exclusion. That is why right-wing extremists rely so much on their role as victims. That's why they provoke. That's why they use trigger words like fake news, left-wing green filth, no freedom of opinion. This already has worked well for the SA and the Waffen-SS. Why shouldn't such models be revived today? And that brings me to our first question, because it only works if we react accordingly. Shall we talk to right-wingers or should we better ignore them? Once again, the more ideological a person is, the stronger his wish to bring others in line. The more populist his language, the more excluding his thinking. The answer is, the more ideological, the less likely it is that talking to the person concerned will get you anything like, for example, a more humane behavior. Worse still, the more ideological, the more likely it is that any attempt to talk to the person in question will aggravate the situation, for example, the exclusion, because the ideologue will use everything we do and with what we argue to drive us further into exclusion and strengthen his populist language to bring more people in line and to strengthen his sympathizing pack internally. Most of you will have experienced this too. I myself have never succeeded in dissuading an extreme ideologue from his ideology by talking to him. I have sometimes managed to make him think me nice and differentiated, but he has only used my arguments to strengthen his ideology. Only with people on the edge conversation might work. Everyone else needs more, sometimes even much more. Those who are already in free fall and think they are flying can no longer be helped. A small but important thought helps to understand it better. When people harm other people, animals, or the environment, the more the insecure they feel, the harder they can bear this thought. That is why so many, when they are caught wrong, add further harm. This can become a spiral that destroys us all, and I therefore believe that it is our duty not to give people the opportunity to do more harm in such situations. Now, many think that we must endure the conflict that right-wingers bring to us. My view is quite different. In extreme cases, this is not a conflict that promotes our democracy. It is a conflict that harms us. The more laxly we deal with it, the more space we give extremists. The more we try to prove how democratic we think, the more platform we give them. And since they don't change their populist rhetoric, that means we give them a chance to reach more people. That is how they dismount democracy with democratic means and make us their henchmen. So what is the best way to deal with right-wing populism? Clearly demarcate for democratic and human purposes and then keep silent. Any less stringent reaction could make me an accessory to their anti-democratic goals. This is a challenge we all have to face, and I am very interested in how the media deal with it, for example, when they realize that this is the functional way to behave. Will they follow their money-making impulses to continue to be the first to report and give right-wingers a platform? Or will they react more cautiously, prudently and withdrawn? Will politicians follow the logic of our argumentation, or will they continue to give in to the impulse to exclude with help of their own ideology and use right-wingers to position themselves? It is a systemic challenge. The more we realize that we must first position ourselves clearly and then ignore right-wingers, the more effective this strategy becomes. It will be interesting to see what will happen.